Hey, good evening and welcome. My name is Doug Stark and I'm the Museum Director at the International Tennis Hall of Fame, and it's wonderful to see so many people participate in tonight's event. Tonight's program, Black Tennis in Rhode Island, is the first of two virtual programs we are hosting this February to coincide with Black History Month. Next Wednesday is our second program, Althea, Gibson, and the History of Tennis. Tonight's program, History of Black Tennis in Rhode Island, is presented in association with the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities and brought to you tonight with support from Citizens Bank. This evening, we will have two short presentations to be followed by a question and answer session. All attendees will be muted during the presentations. The Q&A function is now open. Feel free to interact by dropping any messages or questions in the box. We will hold all questions until the end of the presentations. In 2020, the Hall of Fame received a Rhode Island Council for the Humanities Rich Major Grant for a storytelling performance on Black tennis and social justice for the Newport schools. This built off the work of a 2019 mini planning grant also awarded by Rich, entitled In Your Court, Black Tennis and Social Justice, Then and Now. The grant continues a partnership between the Hall of Fame, the Rhode Island Black Storytellers, and Thompson Middle School in Newport that implements these storytelling performances related to Black tennis. This project is designed to improve students' understanding about Black tennis history and foster a greater appreciation of social justice issues in modern society. Leveraging the stories, life lessons, and values of the sport from notable champions will provide a greater understanding of social justice and equality issues, along with the historic processes that enabled such progress in American society. As part of our grant, we worked with two humanities scholars who researched and provided greater context for the interpretation of Black tennis. During this project, significant information related to the development and growth of Black tennis in Rhode Island was uncovered, a topic that is not well documented at the Tennis Hall of Fame. As a result, we decided to offer a program devoted to this very topic. Our first speaker is Robert Savornick, former chair of the history department at Rhode Island College, who is currently an assistant teaching professor at Florida State University. He has written extensively on the intersection of race and sport and co-directs the program, If It Ain't Got That Swing, Baseball, Jazz, and Black Cultural Expression. Our second speaker is Keith Stokes. Keith is presently Vice President of the 1696 Heritage Group. He has also been an advisor for Rhode Island with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He is a frequent national, state, and local lecturer in community and regional planning, historic preservation, and interpretation, with an expertise in early African and Jewish American history. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Well, thank you, Doug. And I just want to make sure that everyone can see the images that are on the screen. I'm not sure if folks haven't been unmuted yet. I still see. Good, okay, all righty. So initially, let me say that I am most appreciative to Doug and to the International Tennis Hall of Fame for arranging a program on local African-American tennis. I firmly believe that the local game provides an intimate look at the communities and neighborhoods that supported the sport. I'd like to provide a brief overview of the presentation, and then we'll get right into it. I'll open with the development of the local Black game from recreation to club status. and then focus on two clubs, linking each to an historical theme. First, the Alex Gorham Club and the politics of representation, and second, the Racknets and cultural expression. Finally, we'll take a look at the Black press and how it shaped the historical narrative of Black tennis, and then, time permitting, any avenues for future research. So many of the earliest references to Black tennis in Rhode Island relate to leisure and recreation. At the turn of the 20th century, professional, middle to upper class African Americans engaged in new forms of leisure activities like tennis, sponsored by resorts like the Westview Cottage in Jamestown, Rhode Island. In 1907, the arrival list for the cottage included affluent African Americans from New York, New Orleans, and Providence, and also the arrival of Booker T. Washington, former slave who later founded Tuskegee Institute and became a leading national spokesperson for Black business and the Black elite. Transition of tennis to African-American civic, fraternal, social, and athletic associations highlights the crucial role these organizations played in the community, especially along the lines of self-help and racial uplift. One of the earliest and most successful social and athletic organizations was the Marathon Club. The club was established in 1905 with the help of Roberta Dunbar, a suffragist, an active participant in many Rhode Island African-American women's political and charitable organizations. The Marathons arranged the first recorded competitive tournament among its members in 1917. In the 1920s, we see the beginning of the tennis club movement. Many of these clubs processed incorporation papers with the state of Rhode Island as non-business entities that existed for the benefit of their members and with the intention that they would eventually acquire property for a clubhouse and courts. And here's a list of the major clubs on record. Alex Gorham would be the first out of Providence. It would eventually become What Cheer Tennis Club. It would change names, and we'll talk about that in a second, in June of 28. The Old Hometown Tennis Club, which Keith will tell us a lot about in a few minutes, follows in October of 29. Little Rhodey, the Racknets, which I will talk about in a few minutes, and with time permitting, a really interesting tennis club, which starts in 43, called Hillside down in Kingston. One of the most fascinating clubs is the Alex Gorham Club, established by Caroline D. Gorham to memorialize her husband, Alex, who actually made his money in a way that most members of the club would not approve. Alex was born in Providence in 1836, but after serving in the Civil War, he relocated to New York City, where he operated a saloon on Thompson Street in New York's Greenwich Village. The bar featured gambling and served both working class whites and Blacks in a very rough and tumble atmosphere in one of New York's earliest black and tans. Black and tan, that's the term given to integrated bars in the late 19th century. So Caroline memorializes her husband by naming Providence's most exclusive African-American athletic club after him. The club became a founding member of the New England Tennis Association in 1925. The NETA served as the regional representative of the American Tennis Association, established in Washington, D.C. in 1916. The ATA can be compared to the establishment of other Black-controlled sports organizations that crown champions, including baseball's Negro National League, created in 1920, and golf's United Golf Association, established in 1925. The Gorham Club held the prestige to stage the NETA's first tournament in 1926. Over the years, Providence would host several NETA tournaments that featured splendidly talented players like Ora Washington. Washington's victory in the 1937 NETA tournament catapulted her to her last ATA singles championship later that year. After Caroline Gorman's death, the club changed its name to the What Cheer Tennis Club, and Dr. Andrew Jackson served as its president. Jackson would hold multiple administrative positions in both the national ATA and regional NETA organizations. He helped shape tennis policy at both levels for over 25 years. For me, anyway, he's the embodiment of Black tennis in Providence. He was also a leading civic, political, and religious leader. His power base emanated from the Condon Street Baptist Church. Gorham and later Wattier, I believe, shed light on the role sports played in supporting the politics of respectability, a prevalent ideology among the Black elite. If you view the mission statement of the Gorham Club, it highlights, I think, several key elements of that ideology. So if we look at by and among its members, I think that speaks to the issue of exclusivity. Amateur sport addresses the upper class notion of the amateur ideal in athletics. Knowledge, of course, refers to education, and maintaining a clubhouse recognizes the importance of property for class position, and equally important, its stabilizing influence in the community. So if we impose the traditional definition of the politics of respectability offered by historian Kevin Gaines, I think then we begin to see the connection and the support tennis offered this ideology. This is the traditional definition of the politics of respectability, which deals with issues of education, racial solidarity, the acculturation of wealth, self-stable communities, all of this with the express purpose of pushing back against the belief that African Americans were inferior to whites. On the amateur ideal issue, we can provide some context, at least for the city of Providence. Tennis functioned very differently than professional commercialized baseball, for example, in the city, as exemplified by Arthur Black and Daniel Whitehead. I mean, Arthur Daddy Black, he was the silent partner of a professional Black baseball team, which ran out of Providence called the Cleveland Colored Giants. Daniel Whitehead had commercialized Black baseball as early as 1905. Both were money-making operations. And both of these individuals were heavily involved in gambling. Arthur Daddy Black would eventually become the most significant gambling boss in the African-American community before his death in 1932. But it's really, I would say, the issue of property and maintaining a clubhouse. I mean, the importance of property flows like a river through the history of these clubs. One of the earliest articles on Gorham mentions the desire to purchase property. In Watier's case, the Providence Journal reported on the club's purchase of a 2-acre lot in Riverside, complete with clubhouse and dining room tables. Finally, the issue of property becomes really personified in Gorham himself, Alex Gorham. He would use the money he made in New York to become Rhode Island's premier Black landowner and landlord. But I would say the beauty of Black tennis in Rhode Island is the counter narrative to Gorham and Wattier. In the early 1930s, a neighborhood club without real estate and comprised of poor and working class young Black men and women emerged in Providence's East Side African American community. That tennis club was called the Racknets. They appeared to play a different game, one that emerged from the streets and played on Providence's city courts. Public space, not private space. The integration of public space, like Roger Williams Park, occupied as much agency as private club ownership for the Racknet Club. It's democratization from the bottom up. It's performance identity, not status identity. Shortly after the Racknets were established, Providence's leading Black sports writer, Armando Perry, wrote, quote, "Whatever its past history may be, the game of tennis is slowly being adopted by all who have the ability to play it. Yet even today, the class distinction exists," close quote. Now, much of my understanding of the Racknets comes from an interview that I did with Paul Cardoza back in 2006. I'm going to share with you just one story from that interview. Mr. Cardoza, during the interview, very carefully lays out the class geography of the East Side. Clear boundaries where the rich lived and the poor lived, separated by race. And certainly he identified himself as a resident of the poor side of town. And lo and behold, one Saturday morning, a limousine arrives at his house, and the driver comes out, asks for Paul, and the driver says that he's there on behalf of Senator Theodore Francis Green. The senator had requested that Paul teach him how to play tennis. The senator had seen Paul play on the courts of Brown University and thought there was no one better. And that's an accurate description. During this time period, during the 1930s, the early 1930s, there was no better tennis player in Providence than Paul Cardoza, black or white. You know, the Racknets even had a fight song. You know, I can't imagine Gorham or even what cheer sort of having a fight song, but they certainly did. So the closest I could get to what may have been a different style of play, one which emphasizes cultural expression or innovation seen on the streets of Providence, actually comes from a Harlem Renaissance poet, Sterling Brown, who wrote that in his early years, when he was an undergraduate at William College, he learned to drive the ball, right, serve and volley. But back home on the streets of Washington, D.C., he played a scrambling game. And my conversation with Mr. Cardoza certainly underscored this notion that the Racknets were playing something a little different, playing a scrambling game. So, you know, as we look at, or as we examine Gorman, and as we look at the Racknets, I think we can draw a number of conclusions, but certainly one concluding thought would be that the social life which tennis provided clearly unified the African-American community. But at the same time, it accentuated class differences. I'll steal a quote from John Blassingame to sort of summarize at least our thinking on these two clubs. And with that, I'll end, except to say that we are incredibly fortunate in Providence when it comes to especially African-American sports, because we had a weekly newspaper, the Providence Chronicle, started as the Boston Chronicle with a Providence sports page, essentially. And rummaging through the Dr. Gross papers, I came across an interesting notation that said in the summer of 1923, after a tennis match, right, between Boston and Providence, and that really was a rivalry between those two cities, copies of the Boston Chronicle were made available. At that point, Dr. Wiley takes it upon himself not only to write a Providence Chronicle, but to distribute the Providence Chronicle, to distribute the Boston Chronicle in Providence. And since then, we have been blessed with incredibly talented African-American sports writers, Armando Perry in particular, and also Perry Watkins. So my sense is that for those of us who are interested in pursuing, and I would argue, this is something that is an important task. The resources are there. You get a very, very careful account of African-American tennis in Providence and Newport through the Black press. So with that, I will end and turn it over to Keith.
All right, let me just set up my screen here. I think we're all set. Robert, thank you. And I want to thank Doug and his team and everyone at the International Tennis Hall of Fame for this opportunity, because as someone who's intimately involved in all aspects of African heritage and history, it's always great to have an opportunity to present history from a unique perspective. And clearly, having a discussion about African heritage participation, not only tennis, but early recreational activities in the early part of the 20th century is unique and important. And as Robert pointed out, the history of Providence is equally mirrored by the history of Newport. And what I'm going to do for a short period of time is kind of walk you through the origins of the Old Town Hometown Tennis and Athletic Club in Newport, and even more importantly, how it was a part of a larger strategy of enhancing and advancing Black civic social equity during the early 20th century. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that the images that you see are largely a part of the collections of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, a wonderful asset that we have right here in Rhode Island. I think one of the most important aspects of presenting this history and kind of understanding the origins of the hometown club is to understand the origins of the African heritage people themselves. When most people think of Newport during the Gilded Age, that time between about 1880 and about 1930, they tend to think of the opulence that are tied to some of the wealthiest families and the summer colonists of the time. But very few people would realize that at the exact same time, Newport also had a very vibrant African heritage community. Not only those that lived year-round within the city, but those that came in the summer as a part of a very vibrant and very active Black social life in Rhode Island, and particularly in Newport. And one of the things that we find, which is, I think, quite fascinating, is the fact that Newport at that time had a very active, engaged community, and that community was involved in establishing civic organizations, political organizations, religious organizations, and all anchored around about 10% of the entire population being of African heritage. And for the most part, many of those families lived, worked, and worshiped in what are today some of the most historic neighborhoods of Newport, what we call the Point neighborhood on the waterfront, Historic Hill and top of the hill, which is Bellevue Avenue, and certainly Broadway and the West Broadway waterfront area. So at the time of the advent of what would become the old hometown club, you already had a very vibrant, engaged African-American community. That community was anchored around the Black church. The Black church then, as the Black church today, is the center of not only religious activity, but social and political activity. It's one of the few places in American history where African heritage people can come together and organize and engage on any topic or any issue without any level of white oversight or intrusion or interference. So you see historically the Black church as being the launching ground of not only religious activities, but political activities, civic activities, and recreational activities. And in the case of Newport, by the beginning of the 20th century, there are 4 vibrant African-American churches. The Union Colored Congregational Church, which dates back to 1780 and an early African benevolent society. You have the Mount Zion African Methodist Episcopal Church, dating back to 1845. The Shiloh Baptist Church, the first Black Baptist church in Newport from 1865. And then the Mount Olivet Baptist Church, which is really an extension of the Shiloh Baptist Church, which establishes itself by 1899. So these 4 vibrant churches are not only places of worship, but they're attracting the best and brightest in a large percentage of the African heritage community of its time. By the early 20th century, it's the Mount Olivet Baptist Church that becomes the center of activity. In fact, by 1919, they're launching what becomes the Newport branch of the NAACP, and many of the men and women who launched that branch later become the leaders and organizers of the Hometown Tennis Club. The Mount Zion Church is also actively engaged, along with the Congregational Church and the Shiloh Baptist Church, in supporting a very interesting concept that's initiated initially through the Mount Olivet Baptist Church, but led by several very engaged young men in Newport. One, a Cromwell Payne West, who's a pharmacist and a track and cross-country athlete in his own right, who has a real belief in that social uplift is directly tied to physical culture and uplift. And he's joined by several other young, dynamic men and women who believe very passionately that one of the critical paths to social equality is to begin to introduce young people and build a sense of self-determination and identity through physical fitness. And it's this Cromwell Payne West, who is an active pharmacist in Newport at the time. He's a graduate of Howard University Pharmacy School. Most importantly, he's a founder of the NAACP. He is a trustee of the Colored Union Church. He is a founder of the Democratic Club of Newport. He is literally one of the leading colored citizens or citizens of color of his time. And he is leading this effort to join social uplift with physical uplift. And then by 1927, they come together and they organize, initially at the Mount Olivet Baptist Church, literally in the backyard of that church on Thames Street, which still exists, the initial tennis courts that would be the location for the old hometown tennis and athletic club. The second person who's very engaged in leading this effort and raising money on behalf of the club is a Charles Judson Becker. Charles Becker is a Massachusetts native. He's a Fall River resident, but he's an active member of a number of Newport, white and of color, civic and benevolent organizations and Masonic organizations. He's spending a lot of his summertime in Newport, as many other African Americans were. And he, along with West, are now raising money, raising consciousness, and really lifting this connection between social justice and physical activity by establishing this hometown club. One of the most exciting aspects of this club is that it begins to take off at a time when Newport is now very much at the center of what we now recognize as a summer resort community or colony. And it's almost establishing this kind of new type of urban setting where people are specifically choosing to come to Newport to spend time there, to socialize, to enjoy recreational activities, and enjoy their opportunity to engage people like themselves and families like themselves. The African Heritage community was in the same circumstance. As the old hometown tennis and athletic club was being established, so were African American biking clubs, fishing clubs, riding clubs, beach clubs, and other types of assortment of social clubs. One of the most interesting aspects is the fact that tennis takes off relatively slow within the African American community, possibly because there were so many choices at that time for young people, and also because of the fact that it really was an individual event and not a group event. In fact, one of the things that we find, which is a fascinating discussion going on in Newport at that time, is that the individual sports such as golfing, such as tennis, even cross-country running, was less inclined by the African American community as an organizational technique, because the feeling is that we want to bring as many young people together, and we also want them to bring them together in a recreational environment where there's teamwork, where there is a sacrifice of self, because they saw those same techniques, those same personality capabilities to be translated later as young adults who would be members of African American political and social uplift organizations. So as Robert pointed out very well, as the Marathon Club is organizing itself in Providence, the Marathon Club is influencing Newport, and there are matches not only in tennis, but there are football matches. There are women's running matches going on between the communities. And we see Newport really focused more on the group events and less the individual events, but it is the Cromwell West and others who feel strongly that tennis also has to play an important role. And it does play an important role. In fact, one of the most, I think, interesting aspects of this club and other clubs that would follow is that the African Heritage community at that time was not looking for integration. While New England generally, and Rhode Island and Newport specifically, were more progressive based on early 20th century interpretation than the American South, and there may not have been Jim Crow laws in effect, there were certainly Jim Crow traditions. And in those Jim Crow traditions, white clubs and clubs of color were separate and apart. Largely male clubs and largely women clubs were separate and apart. So for the African Heritage community, the formation of the Old Hometown Tennis Club and other organizations was not because they were responding to the Jim Crow traditions of Newport solely. It was also because of the fact that they weren't seeking to be a part of these white institutions. They were seeking to build their own interdependence, their own capacity for education, for training, for self-determination, and recreational and physical opportunity. So what's most important about this time that we should recognize is that despite the early 20th century limitations on racial relations, people of color still took it upon themselves, raised their own money, their own consciousness, and supported their own youth to have access to any and all of the opportunities that any of that youth at that time would make available to them. And tennis was one of those options and opportunities. And I just want to kind of wrap up here by giving a sense of how important this is, even myself on a personal level. I have family members and ancestors who were part of the founding of the club and the NAACP. My own uncle, Alfred Stewart Barkley, who grew up in Newport, became in the early 1940s as a 17-year-old a city tennis champ. And I have his tennis racket. And he would later become, during World War II, a member of the famous Tuskegee Airmen and unfortunately die 2 weeks before his 21st birthday in service to his country. But it's because of growing up in this very strong African heritage community and family, having access to opportunities like playing tennis, and boy, he loved to play tennis, which was largely unheard of and unavailable for many other African-American men and women at that time. But it gave him an opportunity to pursue something that he was good at, something that could build his character, and that character would carry forward in his life and his contribution on behalf of his country as a part of America's greatest generation during World War II. So these 15 minutes that Robin and I are sharing you is the beginning point, because we've been very honored to be able to come together to begin this research, to collect this information, to work on behalf of the International Tennis Hall of Fame. And I'm very excited about the fact that this is going to set a platform for us to be able to design and develop and research and present additional historical interpretations of early life in Rhode Island, but particularly from the perspective of African heritage men, women, and families. This last slide that I'll add you is a bit of a teaser. The Rhode Island Black Heritage Society has a significant amount of collections. And as a part of our collections, we have collections of the Little Rhodey Tennis Club. And this here is a 1952 list of 48 African-American tennis clubs all across the Northeast, from Philadelphia to Massachusetts. Each and every one of these clubs, I can tell you, had membership and participation of African-American men and women and families who were actively engaged in their churches, in their civic organizations, in their political organizations. They were engaged. So again, the goal of connecting social uplift with physical uplift works. It worked then, and it should continue to work today. So again, thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to answer questions and to work further in this great endeavor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob and Keith, for a wonderful introduction to this topic. At this time, we'd like to open up the floor for questions. Feel free to type your question into the Q&A function on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can. To get things started, both of you referenced some of the sources of this. Keith, you mentioned the collection of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, and Bob, you mentioned the Providence Chronicle with their two writers, the Dr. Gross papers. Maybe just to give everybody a sense, how are you able to compile this information? Where are the best sources, and where might the gaps be that you've noticed so far? And just trying to understand if somebody wanted to learn a little bit more, because some of this information is clearly either undocumented or underdocumented. And certainly at the Tennis Hall of Fame, we don't possess records documenting Black tennis in Rhode Island. So if you maybe could each spend a few minutes just sort of giving a sense of the sort of the historical landscape, the collections out there.
Do you want to go first, Keith, or do you want me to go?
Oh, go ahead, Robert.
Well, I think if you have an African-American newspaper with talented African-American sports writers, that's going to be your main source of information. And we're privileged to have that in Providence with the Providence Chronicle. But of course, there's going to be gaps. And, like I started this process many years ago. I referenced a 2006 interview that I did with Paul Cardoza. At that point, he was 93 years old. He had come to Rhode Island in 1920 and was able to paint a very graceful portrait of life in Providence during the 30s. And I was able to ask him a number of questions that the newspapers or traditional sources did not yield. We can't do that anymore. I think Mr. Cardoza was probably the last person that could provide that information, and that generation is no longer gone. So, I would say, of course, a newspaper sources, but Keith's presentation, which was wonderfully done in terms of the connections between sport and politics, or sport and leading members of the community. You often find information in places that you don't, you're looking at the sports page, but information comes in other places. So I would say keep your eyes wide open, because the folks who are involved in tennis, especially financially supporting tennis or providing the administrative assistance to get these clubs going, are major players in the African-American community. And you can get some good information from them, from other sources. The last thing I'll say is that we're also dealing with the period of multi-sport athletes. In the 21st century, very rarely do you get folks who play more than one sport. And one of the things that you can do is you can trace folks through other sports as well. Mr. Cardoza said, I wasn't really interested in tennis, but I didn't want to play spring football. And I was terrible at baseball. So I wound up playing tennis, and then ultimately became the singles champion in tennis for I don't know how many years. So oftentimes what you catch are information on some of these athletes from other sports too. So those were some of the things that I can share.
Now, I would just offer that African heritage and history has been hiding in plain sight. I think the challenge is that for whatever reason, sometimes we focus in interpreting African-American history in a very linear and limited fashion. We tend to focus on slavery and the slave trade. We tend to focus on elite people from Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and such. And we tend not to look at the day-to-day activity of the average person, which are very well documented. In fact, not only the Black Heritage Society, Newport Historical Society, Rhode Island Historical Society, our state archives, all have reams of information on the African heritage experience from colonial era and going forward. It's just a matter of what you're looking for and what you value. So in the case of tennis, as an example, Robert did a great presentation. He talked about people like Roberta Dunbar and Joseph LeCount and Andrew Bell. And we all have significant information about those men and women because they were so dynamic and active in every which way in the times that they lived in Rhode Island, from civic to religious to political. They were active and they're documented. So again, I think the challenge is that we just need to look more broadly and innovatively. And that's why I give kudos to the International Tennis Hall of Fame, because this presentation is innovative. It's unique. It stands apart from standard what people see as African heritage history. So it's all there, and the stories are there, and the interpretation is there. It just needs new and dynamic and interested researchers who want to bring these stories to life.
And just to add to that, Roberta Dunbar, there was an absolutely incredible done on her recently by Elisa Miller from Rhode Island College. I would really recommend folks read that as an example of how a talented historian can cobble together information and resources to produce a multifaceted look at an incredibly fascinating woman. Yeah, Roberta Dunbar. You're absolutely right.
Great. Thank you. So we have a number of questions that I'd like to, hopefully we have time to address. One is from Julia Renaud, who's from the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities. And she specifically had a question for Bob to say a little bit more about the difference between the scrambling game and the serve and volley game that was played at Williams and Brown.
Right, and I'll tell you a good portion of that came from my discussion with Paul Cardoza. Paul said he learned to play the game in the streets or, volleying against a brick wall. He tended to think that it was a game which was much more angular. Sterling refers to it as a scrambling game. I think when folks focus on the Williams sisters, Serena in particular, as someone who has changed the game, that there is a good deal of cultural expression within the recent game, I think you have to look back. I think you can see, especially within the local game, evidence that African Americans had used sport as a form of expression. You know, one of the things I didn't get into was this whole notion of what role does sports play in the Harlem Renaissance, which in the literature now has become somewhat controversial, right? You know, is sport, can sport be seen as a form of expression? You know, contrasted to literary and artistic expression, but is there a poetry, is there an expression which comes from sport? I think the scrambling game sort of represents that, right? I don't want to take up too much time, but I was able to interview an African-American baseball player, Charlie Butler, who said that, you know, when the Black baseball players played their game, especially if they were playing white teams, they played a certain game. But after supper, when the Black teams played the other Black teams or they played amongst themselves, there was a much more lively and a much more culturally expressive game. I guess I'm suggesting here that this doesn't start with Serena Williams. It starts way before.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from a Gregory Edmonds. And one of your last slide, Keith, referenced these 48 clubs, African-American clubs on the Little Rhodey list. And the question is, do any of these clubs still exist? And maybe more specifically, what sites might still exist in Rhode Island related to the clubs, the tennis courts, some of these places where people participated?
That's a great question. And that's a great next phase research project for a young scholar. You know, again, for the most part, what I have found in looking at these sites were almost consistently associated with a location that was a part of the Black community or Black identity. In the case of the old hometown tennis and athletic club, it was the backyard of the Mount Olivet Baptist Church, or it would have been tied to a public place where African heritage people were comfortable going to and participating in. So in the case of Providence, in the case of the Roger Williams Park, well, Black folks have been operating Emancipation Day festivals in the tens of thousands since the 1850s at Roger Williams Park. That was a safe place to go. It was a place where they could congregate and go safely. So when you begin thinking about where people might have attended events, set up events, think in terms of where you were most safe, where you had less concern about white oversight or interference at that time. So people were thinking smartly, they were thinking strategically, and they were also thinking close to home and what they did best. And again, what I was trying to say before and emphasize is that the most important aspect of the formation of these tennis clubs was that it was not to achieve integration with white clubs or not to show white clubs and white society what we can do and that we are equal. That was not their interest at the time. Their interest at that time was achieving interdependence, ensuring that their children would have equal access to recreation activities and use those recreation activities as a part of their larger social and political and personal uplift. Interdependence as a goal is very different than integration. And these tennis clubs very much, in my mind, reflected the very best of interdependent living in early, mid-20th century America for the African heritage community.
Yeah, and I would just add, if you take a look at the What Cheer Tennis Club, the Great Depression, regrettably, has a devastating effect on the African-American community in Providence. What Cheer loses its property during the early 1930s. It's just difficult to keep up with it. It has to sell the property. There are some issues regarding repairs, and the city is not very forgiving in terms of what it's going to allow in terms of construction and all of that. Well, anyway, long story short, the 1920s in some ways can be considered a golden age of sport, not just for whites, but for African Americans. But the 1930s, a lot of that real estate, which was acquired in the 20s, unfortunately is lost during the 1930s, during the Great Depression. So in terms of physical structures and things of that sort, it's very, 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 very difficult. If you look at what I'll call the public courts, the Patterson Street courts, or, the courts on the east side, or the neighborhood courts. Of course, they're still there in many instances. But the clubs, the actual clubs, they lost their property, many of them during the Depression.
Great, thank you. We also have another interesting question from Gregory Edmonds, and around the early years of World War II, there was a quite famous and much publicized interracial or integrated tennis match that took place at the Cosmopolitan Tennis Club in Harlem between Don Budge and Jimmy McDaniel. And the question is, was there ever an integrated tennis match, to your knowledge, that happened in Rhode Island, or anything of that nature?
I've never recalled one. Robert, have you?
No. I think the NETA, played other African-American clubs. Outside of Senator Theodore Francis Green playing Paul Cardoza, I'm having a hard time figuring out if there's any competition between African-Americans and whites during this time period.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize again that the goal within the African heritage community was not to compete with whites or to achieve with whites or integrate with whites. It was about creating their own self-sustaining opportunities for themselves. I can give you a kind of a fun analogy in Newport at that time, even earlier. My grandfather and great uncle were part of the Ugly Man's Fishing Club in the turn of the 20th century. And the Ugly Man's Fishing Club was a black men's fishing club. Men of color came from New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, down to Newport in the summer, and they fished on Ocean Drive. And the reason they created the club was that Newport at the time had dozens of men's fishing clubs, all segregated, all white. So these men came together and decided that, we're not going to be a part of these other clubs. They don't want us. We don't want to be a part of it. So we're just going to establish our own club and go fish and have a great time. And the reason they called it the Ugly Man's Fishing Club is that, well, I guess there must be a reason why they don't accept us in the other clubs. Many of us are college educated, business professionals, have status in the community. So it must be because we're unattractive men. It can't be anything else. So my point being is that for lots of black folks at that time, rather than worrying about prejudice and discrimination, they spent more time and effort building their own community and building their own identity, and particularly through the youth. And you see that transferred within recreational activities.
Yeah, and that was not the case with baseball. Most of my background comes with studying African-American baseball in Providence, and there's a significant amount of integration in African-American baseball, but that's because it is a commercial enterprise. You have black teams playing.
Absolutely, yeah.
You have the integration of white teams during the 1920s. You have African-Americans and whites playing on the same team in the 1920s. That's a story which I'm telling now and sort of writing up now, but I think people would be surprised to see the level of integration there. But that's because it's commercial, right? There's money to be made. There's a difference between getting a check at the end of the month as a professional ball player, or splitting the gate at the end of a game, and getting a loving cup. And I think that makes all the difference in the world. And in some
or a club sport. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Robert.
Yeah. And the money aspect, at least as far as the commercialization of, and the same thing holds for basketball. There's a hidden history of African-American basketball, which is equally compelling to baseball and to tennis, and that needs to be told as well. I don't know if there are any questions regarding the gender issue here too, but there's a gendered part to this story too, which, I didn't get a chance to mention given the limitations here, but I would hope that maybe there would be a question on gender, or maybe there would be at least some discussion on that at some point too.
So that actually brings me to make an advanced plug for next week's program on Althea Gibson. In recent years, there's been a lot of renewed interest in Althea, from films to dissertations to articles, as a two-sport star in golf and tennis. But Bob, you referenced Ora Mae Washington, from the 20s and 30s, who really was Althea Gibson before Althea Gibson in many ways. So can maybe just say a few words about Aura and, you know, where she sort of fits into the larger landscape?
Well, you know, Aura Washington gained admission into the National Basketball Hall of Fame not too long ago as a sort of multi-sport athlete. You know, she excelled in tennis and she excelled in basketball. And her tennis career sometimes is not as carefully looked at or as respected as it should be. I mean, I think her basketball career sometimes overshadows that. She had played for a championship basketball team out of Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Tribune newspaper had sponsored. But Aura Washington, if you take a look at her record, and I had an opportunity to sort of take a look at it before this presentation, you know, sort of 8 singles championship. I think she won 7 in a row, right? She was untouchable for a fairly long period of time. Her singles play, but also her doubles play. You know, certainly someone that could easily be considered for entrance into the Tennis Hall of Fame, you know, if I can put a plug in for Aura Washington. But again, the issues, and here's where we wanted to get to the gender issue. The restrictions that are placed on female athletes during this time are particularly strenuous for African-American women tennis players. And I think that's an avenue of research that we need to sort of take a careful look at as well. So, you know, nowadays we have these articles sort of on the restraints or the policing of the Black female athletic body, especially as it relates to Serena. You can go back to Aura Washington and you can see the way in which newspapers are framing her style of play, framing her. So in some ways, it's not just her prowess on the tennis court, but it's her ability to be the person she wants to be, and other people have to deal with it. She wasn't, you know, someone who held to the restraints that others were placing on the Black female tennis body during the 1920s and 30s.
Great, thank you. So we are coming up on the hour, and I do have a few more quick questions or points to address. One is the Ugly Men's, referring to the Ugly Men's Fishing Club. Did Blacks attempt joining mainstream white clubs and get rebuffed, or was it tacit and unspoken that segregation was the norm and they took action accordingly?
It's 1920. It's the tradition. We may not have had Jim Crow laws in New England, but we certainly had Jim Crow tradition, and people were aware of that. And from all the documents that I've read, from personal family documents and letters and correspondence and those of friends and such across New England at that time, there really was less an interest to integrate. I mean, the Black community was not looking to integrate. They were looking to succeed. And they were looking to focus their energies, their wealth, and their personal interest in their community. So they really weren't looking to integrate in larger society. They were just looking for equal opportunity, equal access. And if for whatever reason, that access or that opportunity was being restricted because of a Jim Crow tradition or bigotry, they would then solve that by either a challenge legally, or they would solve it by creating their own opportunity, as long as it was an equal opportunity. So again, what I find on a consistent basis is that people, regardless of race or ethnicity or religion, just want to have good lives. And they want to have happy lives for themselves and their families. And they seek and do those things that help them achieve that good life. So for the most part, people in the 1920s knew exactly what life was like. They knew the challenges that were before them by race and by ethnicity and by sex. And rather than trying to combat them head on, they built their own systems. And Newport is one of those places where lots of folks of color were able to assemble, come together, and express themselves collectively, which was quite successful at that time. So this is yet again hidden history that needs to be further explored, further interpreted, and further presented, because it presents African heritage people not as victims but it presents them as people who are displaying what we call creative survival in achieving and succeeding and thriving despite discrimination.
Yeah, we have just a comment I'd like to read from Kelly Wolf. From a social history perspective, I think it would be interesting to use your research on the history of Black tennis as an example of how Black communities formed and viewed themselves, especially as tied to churches, as a result of the Jim Crow era and its aftermath. To me, it would be a great way to tell the tennis story to a larger audience, which I'm sure you've already thought of already. But obviously, this is hopefully the beginning of a lot more research and in-depth discussion, and just wanted to get your sense if you had any reaction or comments to that.
I just say, Doug, that in scanning the list, the Little Rhodey 1952 list of the Black clubs around the Northeast, I could almost guarantee you that every one of those locations had dynamic and historic Black churches and Black communities. So she's exactly right in her assessment. And this is an opportunity for further original research and further interpretation. And, again, my hats off to the International Tennis Hall of Fame for setting this up.
Thank you. There was a question about who the author again was on about the article or book on Roberta Dunbar.
That would be Elisa Miller, Miller, from Rhode Island College. Her piece appears in a joint publication from the Rhode Island Historical Society and I believe the Newport Historical Society. And I'd be happy to get that information to you, but it's a wonderful, if talking about social history, that's a wonderful example of social history. But the issue of social history or history from the bottom up or democratization from the bottom up, that's why, the Racknets, there's a counter narrative here too a little bit. And I don't want to sort of let that story, die here. That you have a different kind of club emerging, in this case, at least in 1932, which I would say in some ways is qualitatively different than the earlier clubs which were established in the 20s. That I think will bear some fruitful research in the future as well.
So I just want to get to one last question before we wrap up, and this comes from a gentleman, Philip Weinstein. Bob, you referred to a gentleman, Dr. Wiley. If so, I think his son, Alton, the first African-American judge in Rhode Island, deceased recently at 91. His brother was George Wiley, who was a well-known civil rights leader.
Yes, actually welfare rights. George Wiley headed the welfare rights organization, both here and nationally. Yes, incredibly well-respected family in the struggle for civil and human rights. The problem is, if we've been trying to get to the Wiley folks to see if there are any old copies of the Boston Chronicle, because really we only have the Chronicle from 32 on. And literally copies of that newspaper don't exist before that. So if there are any folks out there, including members of the Wiley family or who know the Wileys, and if there are any of those papers around, we would love to have them. And of course, would love to interview folks from the Wiley family too about their relationship to the newspaper, but also to Black tennis.
Great. So Bob, Keith, obviously that was terrific. And thank you both very much for sharing your knowledge tonight on this interesting and important topic. And we wanted to thank all our participants for joining us this evening. This is being recorded, and we will eventually send a link out to this to everyone who registered to this event. And events like this presentation are made possible through generous support of the International Tennis Hall of Fame, which is a nonprofit organization. Donations may be made at tennisfame.com/lecture and are greatly appreciated to enable the Hall of Fame to continue these types of programs. And finally, once again, I'd like to thank the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities and Citizens Bank for their generous support for tonight's program. I hope you'll join us next week for another presentation This one about Hall of Famer Althea Gibson, presented by Damian Thomas, who's the sports curator from the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Once again, thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.